All right, welcome family and friends in church. This is another podcast here for Windsor Christian Church Podcast. We have Dr. Bob Godfrey, Robert Godfrey, and Dr. Godfrey is, right now he's the chairman of Ligonier Ministry you out of Florida?
Yes,
yeah.
yes, Orlando, Florida.
Former president of Westminster Seminary in Southern California.
Right.
Yeah, and we'll just go by Bob.
That's fine.
Okay,
absolutely.
So Bob's out. Yeah, Bob is out kind of visiting. He kind of has some family roots here in Sonoma County. And so we've been able to get him to come to our Bible conference. Rhett got to meet Bob on a Reformation 500-year anniversary in Germany, I think is where
Right.
Rhett met you. Yeah.
Right.
And so he's out doing a Bible conference for us, and he's also doing a little vacationing, a little R&R.
Right, right.
And we really like Bob. And we hope that Bob will be a friend to Windsor Christian Church. So that would be good. Moving forward, and just that people in Florida, wherever you go, would know there's a church out here trying to preach the gospel and be faithful.
Absolutely.
So thanks for coming out, helping us. It's great. So give us a little backstory to yourself. There is a family feud possibly between me and Bob. That's kind of an interesting story back from the 1800s. Bob loves church history too, and so he's a history buff. So this will be fun to think about church history, even locally, and then we'll think about things more on a global level too as we continue with the podcast. So give us a little history about yourself, Bob. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Great to be back in Sonoma County. I was raised in Alameda, California, in the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. And my grandparents, my dad's parents, had a summer cabin in Camp Meeker. And so I have many wonderful memories of coming up to Camp Meeker as a kid. Mm-hmm. But there are even deeper roots in Sonoma County on my mother's side. Her great-great-grandfather came to Occidental in 1855 from England. He was actually Scottish, had married an English woman, and on the trip from Great Britain over to California, the English wife died of yellow fever crossing the Panama Isthmus and was buried at sea. And so he came with my 5-year-old great-grandmother to Occidental and lived the rest of his life there, working in a lumber mill that was owned by his brother-in-law, a man by the name of Joy. And old people in Occidental will know Joy Road and Joy Woods, and so that was a brother-in-law of my great-great-grandfather. So my great-grandmother was a very pious Methodist, and people who know Occidental will know the little white church up on the side of the hill where she attended. This is before the Italians arrived.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Yeah, okay. I mean, the other was interesting too, but this, okay.
Lance is of Italian descent, so the Italians came, and the Methodists knew that those Italians needed saving. And back in 1914, the Methodists in Occidental invited the Methodist preacher from Sebastopol to come and to preach a series of sermons on the dangers of alcohol.
Okay.
We were sure that Italians needed to hear that message.
Yeah.
And so the report I read was that after these anti-alcohol sermons, a group of people from Occidental, and I'm pretty sure it must have been Italians, followed the Methodist minister back to Sebastopol and burned down the Methodist church.
Burned it down.
So apparently they were not converted on the spot.
Okay.
And if you go to Sebastopol today in that large Methodist church on...
Right on the corner of 116?
Yeah, that you will discover was built in 1914 where the Methodists fought back. And, so anyway, Lance and I have an interesting connection that we didn't know anything about till I came for this visit.
Yeah, so. And boy, wine's made an interesting trip through the church as well, right?
Yes,
Bob's Presbyterian. Do you guys serve wine in your communion?
Yeah, I'm actually Dutch Reformed, and we do serve wine in communion.
Okay.
And although we've been sufficiently Americanized that there is a row on the plate of grape juice for those who still have scruples.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I was actually listening to R.C. Sproul talk about, where were we at? I was studying in R.C. Sproul in the Gospels. There was something about wine in there. R.C. Sproul made the comment that the churches in California, a lot of the Christian churches are kind of against alcohol or wine, and so he felt like maybe they had a deal with Welch's grape juice, and that's why they weren't going to do wine in communion. So anyway, we don't do wine, and it's kind of interesting. I've talked to our elders a little bit about it, so it's
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting history in America. It's really in the 1820s, all of a sudden the Protestant churches in America moved against alcohol. You can date it almost to the year. And I think partly it's with the expanding frontier where there wasn't wine or beer, there was only whiskey, and whiskey was being abused. So a lot of people decided it was just better to avoid alcohol altogether.
Yeah.
And then that became a powerful tradition, a powerful distinctive amongst most Protestants. And when I was growing up, it was pretty universally true that serious Christians didn't touch alcohol. And it's curious how over the last 50 years that has changed significantly.
Yeah.
And just as Sonoma County has changed. When I was a kid, we came up here for boysenberries and Gravenstein apples.
Okay.
And now a lot of those crops are disappearing with the advance of wine.
Yep.
And I said once to a farmer, "It's really too bad." And he smiled and he said, "Well, it's really that grapes are making a comeback, that grapes were here before Prohibition.
Oh, right.
A lot of them were torn out because there wasn't any profit in growing grapes during Prohibition. And so now the grapes are so profitable, they're making a comeback. So things keep changing.
Yeah. I remember MacArthur talking about, I want to stay on track, but MacArthur talked about a lot of the, I want to say legalistic, but rules that the church formed through those frontier years were what was going on at the saloon, where men were kind of ruining their lives down at the saloon.
Right,
so you
exactly.
had smoking, gambling, drinking, dancing. So all those things that were associated with the saloon then became like no-nos for the church, and those kind of rules just kind of got passed to different generations,
It was also, that's perfectly true, but it was also somewhat a class thing. So a lot of Protestants were sort of middle class, and drinking and dancing were things that the more upper class people, the Episcopalians, did.
Okay.
And so part of the way we set ourselves off against what we saw as the more degenerate lifestyles of the rich were to deny dancing, to deny drinking. And certainly gambling and card playing, all those things that were seen as kind of a waste of time, among other things. So, that was an issue too.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Good to talk about our family feud a bit. That might be the name of this podcast.
We might be able to be friends by the end.
I think I'm going to take you to a winery for lunch after this. So.
Okay. I won't touch the stuff.
Oh my gosh. We'll do a part 2 and see how our lunch went. Yeah. Contemporary issues. So let's talk about what's going on currently. First, let's get into last night. We talked about Jesus told us to be at peace with one another, and really a lot of the rebukes to the disciples were helping us to actually be at peace with one another. So denying ourselves and being humble and being weak, being vulnerable, all has to do with being at peace too. Those are all key elements of that. But we do see in the church a need to, as Jude would say, defend the faith. And so like my pastor, John MacArthur, he's a defender of the faith, and he takes on a lot of big issues and hits them pretty head on. So
Right.
And R.C. Sproul did too. I feel like, so what would be your encouragement to pastors with dealing with the contemporary issues and taking some of those things on, but still being at peace with one another?
Right. Well, I think the crucial thing we were looking at last night from Mark chapter 9 was the attitude towards someone who's casting out demons but wasn't following with the disciples. And wasn't following us.
Yes.
And Jesus says, but he's casting them out in my name. So it was the connection to Jesus, even if not connected to a specific group of disciples. That Jesus says we need to be at peace. We need to say that those who are not against us are for us. But of course, Jesus is making clear there are people who are against him. And those who are against him, we need to be against. So that's what I would say the dividing line. And for most of us, what that really means is what we think about the Jesus of the Bible. We may have certain disagreements about what the Jesus of the Bible taught in specific areas. Is Jesus for drinking or against drinking? Is Jesus for dancing or against dancing? Is Jesus for baptizing only believers or baptizing believers and their children? There are a whole series of issues where we may have disagreements. But if we're all committed to the Bible and what the Bible teaches about these things, if we're all committed to being willing to sit down around with the Bible and look into the Bible about those things, even if we don't reach perfect agreement, we should have a measure of peace with one another because we're committed to Jesus and his word. Where someone like John MacArthur is coming from, and actually where our seminary came from, was to a significant extent born of what was known as the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 20th century. And we're actually coming up on an important anniversary. The founder of our seminary, J. Gresham Machen, wrote in 1923, so 99 years ago.
And he would be a fundamentalist in the fundamentalist camp.
Yes, he was called a fundamentalist in his own day. He was even called Dr. Fundamentalis.
Okay.
He certainly identified in profound ways with the fundamentalists. He was always a little uncomfortable with that because he said, I'm not really defined just by what are known as the fundamentals of the faith. I'm a Presbyterian that embraces the whole Westminster Confession. So he wanted to say, I believe more things than just the fundamentals. But he certainly agreed with the fundamentalists on the fundamentals and wrote this book called Christianity and Liberalism, which is still a marvelous and very readable book today. That the church really ought to study more, because the basic argument of Dr. Machen was there are basic truths that make one a Christian. And those are the chapters of that book. There's a chapter on the Bible. There's a chapter on Christ. There's a chapter on the church. There's a chapter on salvation. He said, these are the things that make a Christian. And he said, now we live in America. We have freedom of religion in America. You have freedom in America to believe any crazy thing you want to believe, but you don't have a right to call that Christianity. Christianity is defined by the Bible. And so if you reject the Bible and the Bible's definition of Christianity, you have the freedom in America to do that, but you really should not call that Christianity. And so this book was very provoking to the liberals because they said, well, we're good Christians. And Machen's book really says, no, you're not. If you don't believe the Jesus of the Bible, you're not a Christian. And not surprisingly, the liberals were really annoyed by that, as John MacArthur has occasionally been annoying to liberals. And Dr. Machen was... Now, Dr. Machen was a Southern gentleman. He was always respectful. He was always kind. But he said, truth remains truth. And you don't have a right to claim to be something that you're not. And that was what really disturbed Dr. Machen. He said, you know, what the liberals are doing is they're continuing to use traditional language that you derive from the Bible, but they're defining the words they use entirely differently. So I saw an illustration of that. I watched the funeral of Bob Dole. I don't know if you... Bob Dole was a senator from Kansas and was a very prominent Republican in Washington.
Center for UCLA basketball?
No.
Bob Dole? No? No college basketball?
No college basketball.
Right, we're going to have to do a fact checker on that.
No. He was a World War II vet, was wounded in the war, became senator from Kansas. Anyway, you know, you need more history.
Yes, absolutely.
And anyway, they did his funeral at the National Cathedral. And the clergy came in before the coffin, and they were shouting, Jesus is resurrection and life. And I thought, well, you know, if you're not as cynical as I am, you may well think, well, this is really encouraging, you know. But think a minute. What does the Scripture say? The Scripture says Jesus is the resurrection and the life. And what these clergy were saying is Jesus is a resurrection. Jesus is a life. They were denying the distinctiveness of Jesus, the uniqueness of Jesus. They were denying implicitly by their language, I don't know what's in their hearts, but implicitly by their language, they were denying that Jesus is the only resurrection and the only life. And that was the kind of thing that Dr. Machen objected to. You don't have a right to take the words resurrection and life on your lips and claim to be Christians if you don't mean by them what the Bible means by them. So I'm not being very peaceable.
Yeah, I was listening to Mark Sayer, and he talked about kind of the current state of Christianity is people want Christianity and like the great aspects of Christianity without Christ. You know, they want the things, but without Jesus. You know, it's like, and I think that's, you know, we're still, you know, living in those days for sure. So let's go down that fundamental highway. Let's get into Bob Jones started becoming kind of the spokesman for fundamentalism, and that would be kind of when you were a teenager. How did you kind of navigate some of that fundamentalism and where it kind of went to?
Well, I was raised in a Methodist family, but my parents really weren't church going.
Okay.
So it was in high school that a friend who was on the swimming team with me invited me to come to church with him, which was a Dutch Reformed church.
Okay.
And that's where I was converted.
And is Alameda still?
In Alameda.
Okay.
Yeah. So
what year was that?
About 1959.
Okay.
So just a little while ago.
Yeah, okay, this is good. I just need a little reference. Okay.
So I was a junior in high school, and it was sort of intriguing. I went to church, and I'd always been told in my Methodist family the Bible was the Word of God, and here were people who really studied the Word of God, heard the Word of God preached, and it all just made perfect sense to me.
What was intriguing to you? Was it the church? Was it the book? Was it the whole deal? What was the...
In a sense, it was the whole deal. I think maybe the first thing that impressed me was I'd occasionally gone to church with my grandmother. Okay. And I remember vividly going with her to a Good Friday service at the Methodist Church.
In Sebastopol?
No, this was in Alameda.
Okay.
And it was a fairly big church. It seated maybe 500, 600 people. And there were maybe, 50 people there. And as a teenager, I looked around and thought, next year I might be the only person here. There's nothing here but old ladies. And then I went to this Christian Reformed church, Dutch Reformed church, and it was pretty full. There were families, kids and middle-aged people and old people. And the singing was really impressive. They sang mainly psalms. And it was sort of the vibrancy of the thing that this is alive. And then the Bible was preached, and the Bible was studied in Sunday school and young people's society. And and what was being taught out of the Bible just seemed to make perfect sense to me. There it was in the Bible. So there was no great intellectual struggle for me. It just seemed right from the beginning.
Dutch Reformed is really big in Central California. Like
in Ripon,
and
in Visalia, and Hanford,
Modesto.
Those are our people. Although I'm not Dutch at all. So,
but you got into a Dutch Reformed church.
Yeah, those churches.
In Alameda, so it spread.
In those days were very ethnic. They were all either. Almost everyone in the church was either an immigrant from the Netherlands or descended from immigrants 2 or 3 or 4 generations back.
Okay. So, when I think of ethnic, I don't think of England. I think of like Mexico, or it's interesting.
All churches in America are in their background ethnic.
Yes. Man, Bob. so much we can talk about.
Yeah.
So how did you? Okay, let's just stay on your path. So, because you're an academic, can you tell us kind of your going into from high school maybe to college to seminary, graduate work?
Yeah, I was always a weird kid.
Okay.
I was old before my time.
Okay, old soul.
I was interested in history when I was in junior high.
Okay.
When I was converted in high school in the Dutch Reformed Church, I went to the minister and asked if I could borrow Calvin's Institutes to read Calvin.
Okay.
And so then I went off to college and majored in history, and was particularly fascinated by Reformation history.
Where'd you go to college?
Stanford.
Okay.
Yeah. And then...
And you said you were interested in Reformation history.
Yeah, 16th century,
yeah, okay.
Luther and Calvin.
Yep.
And then wasn't sure what I wanted to do after college.
Did they have classes at Stanford that taught on some of those?
Yes, there was a marvelous Reformation history class taught by a professor who was a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and he believed all the stuff.
All right.
And his lectures were fabulous. Some of them were really sermons.
Okay.
So it was a wonderful experience. So then I decided I would go to seminary after college.
Okay.
So I went to Gordon Conwell Seminary in Massachusetts. I'd lived all my life in California, so I thought maybe I should go somewhere else.
Okay.
And by doing that, learned California's the best place to be.
Okay.
So then as my seminary years were coming to an end, I was uncertain whether I wanted to go into the pastorate or continue to study. And so I decided the only place I really wanted to study would be to go back to Stanford and do PhD work in Reformation history.
Okay.
So I applied and I got in, and so I went back.
Okay,
And
all right.
spent 4 wonderful years studying history there.
Okay.
Wrote my doctoral dissertation on the consolidation of the Reformation in the Netherlands.
Okay.
It's a book everyone will want to read.
Yeah.
And then went from there to teach at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia for 7 years.
Okay.
And then to come back to California when a branch, what was at that time a branch campus of Westminster, was started in Southern California.
Okay. All right. And that's where you taught and then became the president there?
Right.
Is that how that worked? Okay.
Yeah, that's Protestant purgatory, becoming a president. Yeah.
Okay.
Teaching is fun. Administration is necessary.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. So I guess kind of back to that fundamentals in the 60s, and where were you at in some of that? So that would have been, you'd have been at Stanford, and you'd have the Berkeley stuff going on.
Yeah. When I was an undergraduate,
Stanford that's where the weird stuff is, and we're normal. What was the mindset?
Stanford, when I was an undergraduate, still was not so affected by what was going on at Berkeley.
Okay.
And of course, what was going on at Berkeley, in a significant sense, was driven by opposition to the war in Vietnam. And when I came back to Stanford as a graduate student, those attitudes were more present at Stanford. And yeah, it was a period of sort of doubting and confronting a lot of received values and ideas. And but because I was already a Christian and because I was studying history, I really didn't get involved in much of that. I was sort of, aside from liking folk music, I was not much of a dissenter or a protester.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so and I'm still trying to figure out the different branches of Protestantism. You're in the Reformed branch of that.
Right.
So I'm trying to think of where MacArthur would fit in, because he was more in the Baptist, I guess, side.
Right.
And it was more pronounced or more clear lines then?
Well, what really happens is that in the 16th century, with the beginning of Protestantism, you really have 3 major camps coming out of the Roman Catholic Church. There's the Lutheran camp, there's the Reformed camp, and then there's the Anabaptist camp.
Okay.
And some Baptists think they're descended from the Anabaptists, but they're really not.
Okay.
The Anabaptists are represented today primarily by the Mennonites and the Amish.
Okay.
That's a very different world from the Baptist world. The Baptists, most Baptists, really arise from the Reformed world, and they arise significantly in England. The Reformed world moves to various places in Europe. So there's a Swiss Reformed Church, there's a German Reformed Church, there's a Dutch Reformed Church, there's a French Reformed Church. My wife would insist that I say there's a Hungarian Reformed Church.
Okay.
So the Reformed movement becomes really rather powerful in a variety of churches. And there's a Scottish Reformed Church that is called Presbyterian. So, and in England, while there were strong Reformed people in the Church of England, the Episcopal Church of England, there were also Reformed people who broke away from that church and became Congregationalists. And so the Congregationalists who came to New England early in the history of this country were Reformed, another expression of that Reformed church. And a lot of the disagreements were over how best to have a disciplined Reformed church.
Okay.
And the Episcopalians said the best way to have a disciplined Reformed church is to have bishops to serve as pastors of pastors.
When you say discipline, more organized, is that what you're thinking of, or more structured?
More structured, more disciplined, more promoting spirituality.
Okay.
So do bishops do that? The Presbyterians said no. What you really need is presbyters, ministers, who will supervise one another as equals rather than be under the authority of bishops.
Okay.
And then the Congregationalists came along and they said, no, it should not be regional presbyteries that govern the church, but every local congregation should govern itself. That's the best way to spiritual discipline. And it was really out of some of those discussions that the Baptists first emerged in the 17th century. And the Baptists said, you're never going to have proper discipline until you stop baptizing infants and you require that everyone come to a personal commitment before baptism. That will be the most effective way to have discipline and spirituality and spiritual commitment in the churches. So these are all part, in a sense, of the same family of churches, even though they could disagree rather vigorously with one another.
Yeah.
And each trying to figure out how best to serve Christ and be most spiritually alive and devoted to him.
Yeah.
Then later, the Baptists will split a bit. Baptists are very good at splitting, but Baptists will split a bit over those who remain Calvinistic Baptists.
I'm going to have some jabs at Presbyterian. Okay, I'm just kidding.
Sure, I can take it. I dish it out and I can take it. There were Calvinistic Baptists that often labeled themselves regular Baptists.
Okay.
Regular comes from the Latin word regula, which means rule. These are the Baptists who went by the Calvinistic rule. And on the other side, there emerged general Baptists who were Arminian, who believed in a general redemption.
Okay.
And they actually went at it a fair bit with one another.
Yeah, we're still going at it.
Yeah. So, John Piper, although he would see himself as Reformed, he really comes out of the General Baptist movement.
Okay.
And the General Association of Regular Baptists historically was part of that more Calvinistic Baptist movement.
Yeah, that's our confession came out of Philadelphia in, I want to say, 17th century that we've adopted.
Right.
Yeah, which is more Reformed.
Yes.
Calvinistic.
Right. Yeah. And that Philadelphia confession was really largely influenced by the London Confession, which in turn was a Baptist version of the Westminster Confession. Okay. So you find great overlap in these works. Yeah.
Can we? I didn't prep you for this. Can we talk about a little bit about church and state? That concept, because we've had to deal with that a lot during the pandemic to see where the church, where the state can come in and tell the church what to do. And I feel like California was a real kind of a spearhead for some of the government overreach versus church pushing back, lawsuits. What does the Constitution say? It was crazy. So one of the things I really had to research was, what is separation of church and state? Can I lean on that as a local church? Even the history of it. So do you mind kind of taking us a bit through the history of where that ideal came from? I want to say it was fairly Baptistic as well, but do you want to walk us through that?
Well, the early Reformed churches in the 16th century and into the 17th century strongly believed that the government had an obligation to support true religion.
Okay.
So they believed in established churches supported by the government. So the Church of Scotland, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, was initially established and supported by the government. The Dutch Reformed Church was similarly, it was slightly different, but we...
And the when you say supported, it would be people's taxes that help pay the clergy to have the church. Yeah.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. And
which can get funky.
it can. And to a certain extent, the government was expected to suppress false religion. So initially that meant the Roman Catholics. Later it could mean Baptists. But yeah, that was part of the idea of establishment, that the magistrate ideally, now magistrates are seldom ideal, but magistrates ideally would promote and protect true religion. And the attitude is so foreign to us as Americans, but I always say one way of trying to understand that is in the 16th century, the attitude was false religion is like a plague. It's like a disease. And everyone would agree that a disease ought to be stamped out. A disease that destroys your soul, not just your body, is dangerous. It ought to be stamped out. The government has an obligation to protect you. That was the attitude. That began to change in the 17th century and thereafter as people began to realize the effort to have one true church is leading to more trouble than it's worth. It led to wars in France called the Wars of Religion. It led to civil war in England. At least that was part of the cause of it. So people began to say toleration may be simpler than constantly being at war. And so, yeah, when America was founded, that was part of the principle, that the government would not establish any religion. So the Second Amendment is very clearly a restriction on the government, not a restriction on the churches. And that's why it says the free exercise of religion. I think for us today, that word exercise has to be particularly treasured, because exercise doesn't mean just what you believe in your head, but it means how you live out your religion. And I think we're going to find increasingly in anti-Christian circles in our culture, they're going to say, well, you can believe whatever you want, but you can't live that out. And we as Christians are going to have to be insistent that our Constitution gives us freedom to live out our religion, not just to think crazy things in our head.
Yeah. So Baptist from the Congregationalist governance, right, took that basically to America, for democracy. Is that kind of the foundation of our
Right. Although the earliest, the earliest big denominations in America were the Congregationalists in New England, the Presbyterians in the Mid-Atlantic states, and the Episcopalians in the South. And the Methodists and the Baptists began to grow rapidly only from the early 19th century, what's usually called the Second Awakening. And as the country moved west, it was the Baptists and the Methodists that were most successful in moving west with the country. And so whereas the Methodists and the Baptists were relatively small in, say, 1800, by 1850, they were the two largest denominations in America. So those 50 years represented really dramatic growth and change as the country was changing by its westward movement.
Well, let's go ahead and speed things up then. So we have.
You don't want to linger?
No, I.
Okay, you've got things to do.
Lunch sometime. No.
Yeah.
Well, no, I do like to linger, but I kind of want to see how did we get to where we are today? You know, that's kind of where I like to try to land that. So, and now scholars say we're in a post-Christian America. You know, so what is that? What's the significance of that? How will that affect the church? What can the church do?
Okay, to try to paint a big picture.
Yeah. Okay.
Even though there was no established church in America, it's very clear that from the founding of the Republic until probably into the 20th century, America's basic character was Protestant. And you can see that in an interesting way with the Roman Catholic immigrants that began to come in increasingly large numbers in the later 19th century, so that they even came to Occidental.
Those Italians.
And they were, of course, primarily Irish and Italians and Eastern Europeans. And what is very interesting to observe, for example, with all of the Irish around Boston, the old Protestant Reformed center of America, the Irish Catholic leadership immediately said, we can't send our kids to the public schools because they're Protestant schools. So we need to build Roman Catholic parochial schools to protect our children and to teach them Roman Catholicism. So it's interesting that these immigrants immediately saw that America was a Protestant world and they needed to be protected from it. That continued well into the 20th century, so that when John Kennedy was nominated to be president in 1960, one of the things that was said was, can we dare elect a Roman Catholic president?
And that was more the Protestant.
The Protestant establishment was saying that.
Wow.
And that was such an important factor that John Kennedy, when he got the nomination, made a very public visit, I think it was to Dallas, Texas, to meet with the leading Baptist ministers there so that they could examine him on whether he was really committed to democracy or not. Because the belief was that Roman Catholics, with their hierarchical system, couldn't be trusted to lead a democracy. And it wasn't entirely irrational. In the early 1930s, the Pope had said, Pope Pius XI had said, democracy is incompatible with Roman Catholicism. So less than 30 years before Kennedy was nominated, there was a really bad joke. Do you have time for a bad joke?
Yeah, absolutely.
That went around after Kennedy got elected president. And the joke was, the phone rings at the White House and President Kennedy answers the phone. And all he says is, yes, Father. Okay, Father. Anything you say, Father. Of course, Father, I'll do that. And hangs up. And Jackie Kennedy says to the president, home or Rome? Because Jack Kennedy's father was still living, Joseph Kennedy, who was a huge and not always positive influence in politics.
Okay.
So home or Rome, it was
and that was a real deal.
It was a good Republican Protestant joke.
Yeah.
Other than that, it's not such a great joke.
Yeah. Well, let's
so
keep going
now
with that,
today, what do Protestants say? We're obviously not a Protestant country anymore. All of a sudden, we're in a situation, I don't think there's a single Protestant member of the Supreme Court. That is such a dramatic change over the last 50 years. 50, 60 years ago, almost all the court, there's probably one Jewish seat, all the rest of the court is Protestant. Today, all the court is Jewish and Roman Catholic, and most Protestants say, thank God for all the Roman Catholics, because they're more conservative on social issues. And so there's been this dramatic change. So we don't talk about our Protestant heritage, we talk about our Judeo-Christian heritage. And that's not all bad, but it's a huge change. But now we're really living in the last 10 years in an increasingly post-Christian world where Christian values are no longer the fallback position of our culture. It's now increasingly regarded as a weird part of our heritage, and in the minds of a lot of people, a dangerous part of our heritage. So how is Christianity increasingly seen? It's seen as bigoted and divisive and dangerous. You can see that very much with gay marriage. For a long time, the gays said, all we want is toleration to be able to be married. And in 2015, the court granted that toleration. But now gays, by and large, are saying, we demand that our marriages be approved by everyone. It's not enough that we're being tolerated. We have to have positive approval. And if Christians are unwilling to do that, there's really strong reaction that we're, as I say, intolerant, bigoted.
Are we okay with that? Should we think that's all right? I mean, that's just how we are. Are there things we can do to be more loving?
Well, I think we have to try to be loving. We're not going to convert anybody by just screaming at them. But on the other side of it, I think Christians have to say, we have a right to express publicly our point of view. And we want to do that lovingly. We want to do that sensitively. But we reject the notion that we have to be silent on what we think are basic issues of our faith and of our religion. And this is why recently I've been talking some about Abraham Kuyper. I don't know if you know anything about Abraham Kuyper. He was a leader in the Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands. He, for a time, was a minister, and then he left the ministry to go into politics, because in those days in the Netherlands, clergymen could not serve in the parliament. And he eventually became prime minister. So he had a very successful political career. But what was, I think, so valuable about Kuyper is he said, look, we have to face the fact that Western culture is not going to be Christian the way it was in the old days. And if that's true, we have to figure out how we as Christians are going to relate to that culture. And what Kuyper labored to say was, we want to be a voice in that culture, and we insist on the right to speak out our point of view, even if others don't agree with us. And then in the marketplace of ideas, whether in politics or religion or wherever, we want to be heard, we want to express our views, and we want, to the extent we can, to be influential. And Kuyper was hated by the left in his day. They called him Abraham the Terrible, naming him after Ivan the Terrible, because he stood in the way of their progressive agenda and insisted that Christians couldn't go along with aspects of that agenda. And while he had success in his own day, he also faced a lot of real opposition. And I think we have to be prepared as Christians to face vigorous opposition. And we have to be prepared to stand up for free speech, freedom of religion, and issues guaranteed us in the Constitution against those who would try to deny us free speech and freedom of religion.
Yeah, that's really good. So Kuyper, what are you doing? Are you writing a book about Kuyper? Are you just studying him? Are you fascinated by him? All the above? All the above.
I have a very long list of books that I'll never get to writing. What I did this last year in my Sunday school class in Escondido was to talk about the end of Christendom and how Kuyper can help us face the end of Christendom. And some people said I should write some of that up. So maybe I will.
Yeah, all right. That's good. Well, another contemporary issue would be the transgender issue. Man, it just seems so odd, maybe is the right word to use. Is there a part of history that's dealt with this kind of transgender issue that could help us know how to navigate this? I mean, the end of it doesn't seem like it's going to help anything. It's just strange,
Right. And, last night we were talking in church at the Bible conference. Jesus quoted Genesis saying, God created them male and female.
Mm-hmm.
And what transgendered people are saying to us is that kind of binary thinking is not legitimate, is not descriptive of them, is oppressive, is bigoted, intolerant. We come right back to the same issues.
Right. Yep.
And we as Christians, I think, want to say God created us in a binary way, male
mm-hmm.
and female.
Mm-hmm.
And the very anatomy of our bodies testify to that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that some people may feel differently from that because we live in a fallen world. Mm-hmm. We live in a world where all of us have feelings that are not proper, not
mm-hmm.
legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
They go in various directions.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say that to transgendered people, understandably, they're not very happy with us.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think we have to stand with the Word of God and say God's creative purpose was binary
mm-hmm.
for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And in point of fact, there's a lot of evidence that, at least for many people who think they're transgendered, that proves not to be the way they ultimately understand themselves. Mm-hmm. And for others, they find themselves very depressed by being in that situation. Mm-hmm. And the defenders of transgendered life say, well, they're depressed because there's all this animosity from Christians. Mm-hmm. And we want to say we don't want to be antagonistic. We don't want to be negative. But we do want to say that this is not God's purpose, and mm-hmm. it's not the way to mm-hmm. be ultimately happy. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be difficult for us to bear that witness. But there's a kind of irony, it seems to me, that while still a significant percentage of the country identifies as Christian, we don't know if they're genuinely mm-hmm. Christians or not, mm-hmm. but they describe themselves as Christian, that those people are expected to be silent, even if it's 20, 30, 40% of the country, mm-hmm. Because this very small percentage of the country wants their rights as transgendered people. Mm-hmm. And I think we have a freedom, ought to have a freedom, to speak as lovingly as we can, but mm-hmm. honestly, mm-hmm. about what we see as God's creative purpose.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really like that you said during the Bible conference is Jesus came to help us.
Right.
The Son of God came to help us.
Right.
So great. So, and it's not just great, it's true. Like this, mm-hmm. And he helped mm-hmm. me and he's helped you.
Right.
So what would you say to a transgender person that's struggling or gay in that thought that Jesus came to help you? How would you address them in that context?
Well, I would say, first of all, what we want to think about is who God is as creator,
okay.
who God is as revealer, who God is as redeemer in Christ, and what that says about the general situation of human sinfulness. Mm-hmm. I think maybe I'm no expert in these things, but I think maybe it's a mistake for the church dealing with gay or transgendered people to begin talking about being gay or transgendered. I think where we have to begin is with God. Is there a God? Mm-hmm. Is he holy? What does holiness mean in a God who created us? Mm-hmm. Is the God who exists and created us a God who reveals himself, who talks to us, who has told us what his will is in the Bible? Mm-hmm. And what the Bible says about all of us as human beings is we're sinners mm-hmm. who cannot save ourselves, who are all alienated from God. It's not just one group who's alienated from God. We're all alienated from God. And while we all have certain distinctiveness to our sins, the only really creative thing we're good at is coming up with different kinds of sinfulness. All sin needs to be covered by the blood of Christ, and all sinners have to try to walk in the way of Christ. And that doesn't mean that walking in the way of Christ is always going to be easy, or that there is going to be an immediate change so that everything is now simple. As far as I know, all Christians still wrestle with the problem of sin. It just is a matter of what sins we wrestle with. And so I think part of what we want to say to friends who are gay or transgendered, for example, is let's not start talking about that as if we want to say being gay or transgendered is the most important defining characteristic of any person. The most, we should say as Christians, the most important. The most important defining characteristic of a person is that you're created by God, and then that you're a sinner, and that you're in need of salvation. Those are the things we have to try to talk to initially.
Yeah, good. That's really helpful. Well, oh man, where do we want to go now? I do want to get your thoughts on the war in Russia and Ukraine right now. Can you share just kind of maybe even some history leading up to that, and where is this going, and what should America do?
Well, it's the classic problem, isn't it? That people who are tremendously ambitious and are after power and influence and wealth are willing to do extraordinary things to pursue that. I mean, if we stand back and think of Vladimir Putin, Vladimir Putin is the dictator of Russia. He's able to do in Russia almost anything he wants to do. Reports say he's become a billionaire by the power he exercises in Russia. He's just about 70 years old. How much more wealth and power and influence does he need? I mean, I'm just saying, as we stand back and try to look objectively at this.
But in his mind, is he trying to, maybe seeing he's 70 years old, trying to set up Russia for the next 70 years? And how do I protect my country? Or is it just more land, more power?
I think, in part, as a Russian, he feels that Russia has had a civilizing and helpful influence in countries like Belarus or Ukraine, and therefore he's trying to reassert what he thinks is the positive Russian influence there, and completely misunderstands and has missed the Ukrainian desire for independence and its own character. It's hard to know how sincere he is when he wraps himself in the cloak of Russian Orthodoxy and says, I'm standing against the secularism of the West and its invasion into Eastern Europe. My gut feeling is he's not very sincere about that, but he's got the patriarch of all the Russias to back him in this. One of the problems of the Orthodox churches is that they have, through their whole history, been very subservient to the governments of the nations in which they find themselves.
So not a separation of church and state.
No separation of church and state. And, I think what we find now is, I think probably Putin really thought he could invade the Ukraine and in a week have control of the country. And
they would just surrender. And
And
they're not.
And they're not. And now it's sort of the classic having the tiger by its tail. You can't let go because the tiger will turn on you and destroy you. And I think Putin feels if he admits Russia can't defeat Ukraine, how long will he hold on to power in Russia?
Yeah.
And so Now, I'm no expert in these things either, so these are just my impressions of what's going on. That the tenacity of the Ukrainians in resisting Russia is really impressive. But I read a book some years ago called Bloodlands, that in the 20th century, probably no country has suffered more than the Ukraine. First from Stalin, who starved millions in the Ukraine. And as we're seeing today, Ukraine's a breadbasket. It's one of the most productive wheat growing areas in the world. And to think that those people starved to death because Stalin was stealing all the grain. And then when Hitler came, initially the Ukrainians greeted Hitler as a liberator, and then soon discovered he was not there to help them. And so the Ukrainians really have lost millions and millions of people in the 20th century. And it's almost like they've reached the point where they said, enough, we're not taking this anymore. And are fighting back in a remarkably heroic way. So those are my impressions, only impressions.
Do you like to follow it? I mean, just as a history buff, is that?
Yeah. And of course it is the classic case, isn't it, of a balance of power politics. The West wants to support Ukraine. The West has supported it up to a point, but Putin keeps rattling the nuclear saber. And the West trembles. And I don't claim enough wisdom to know what the right policy ought to be. But one of the things that we live with now is the power of photographs, and to see those apartment buildings, shattered, and to think how long it took to build them, how long it would take to rebuild them. You think these poor people, it's going to be 10 or 20 years before life at best can even begin to return to normal. And it really is tragic and so unnecessary. That's, I guess, what is so often true of war, is that so much of it is unnecessary. And if warfare in the 20th century doesn't prove the Christian case of the sinfulness of human beings, I don't know what would.
The depravity of man,
The depravity of man,
And that's helpful for me, like when I try to share the gospel with the younger generation, is they're seeing like a war in a first world country, like it's so outside, like I haven't even really seen that. The wars that I've kind of been alive to experience have been more of Afghanistan and some of the Middle East. This is a first world country going at it with each other.
It doesn't play very well with the progressive insistence that people are basically good. They're basically good if they get their own way. But the minute there's any kind of disagreement, the human potential for going at each other is pretty severe.
I'm going to skip subjects real quick to another. So let's just, when we'll wrap this up, your favorite theologians, old theologians and then newer contemporary theologians, who do you like?
My favorite theologian is John Calvin. He just is so wise and so insightful. Now, some people have trouble reading 16th century theology because the theologians can go at each other pretty sharply. But when you read Calvin, particularly if you read his commentaries or read his sermons, he's just so in tune with the Bible, so spiritually helpful. So he's my favorite. Maybe second is Luther, because Luther always goes to the heart of spiritual issues. Now, he can be very sharp too, but Luther is great. In terms of a more recent systematic theologian, I really like Herman Bavinck, who's a Dutch Reformed theologian, wrote a 4-volume systematic theology that's been translated at last into English in the last few years. So you don't all have to rush out and learn Dutch to be able to read Bavinck. I really like Kuyper.
Did you learn Dutch to be able to study Bavinck?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And to write my doctoral dissertation.
Okay.
I mean, as a fairly contemporary theologian, I really like R.C. Sproul because I think he's such an effective communicator. He has a whole series of little booklets called Frequently Asked Questions, where he's so succinct and biblical and helpful, answering questions that occur to people. And so, yeah, that would be.
How about living?
Are there living theologians? I shouldn't admit this publicly. I don't read a lot of living theologians.
Okay.
Sinclair Ferguson would be a favorite, certainly.
Okay. You mentioned John Piper.
Yeah.
Respect John.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I personally find more help from Sinclair Ferguson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tim Keller.
I know Tim Keller a little bit. I respect his work, but I would prefer Sinclair Ferguson.
Okay. How about our up-and-coming, he's in his 40s now, heading up Gospel Coalition. He's a Presbyterian pastor. And
Kevin DeYoung.
Kevin DeYoung, yeah.
I think Kevin's done some really good work. And yeah, as a young man, from my point of view, a young man is doing good work. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate Kevin DeYoung too. What do you like to do for fun? We'll end on this note.
I am the dullest person you can imagine. I read novels for fun.
I think you're fascinating.
I read I read history and theology for my work, and I read novels for fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Favorite novels?
My very favorite novel is Tolstoy's War and Peace.
Okay.
A novel a lot of people talk about and fewer people read.
It. Okay. Need to read that.
To live life and not know Natalia Rostov is to just have missed one of the blessings of life.
Okay.
Most Christians prefer Dostoevsky as a Russian novelist to Tolstoy.
Okay.
I'm a Tolstoy fan.
Okay.
His ability to create people, vibrant, interesting people, I think is fascinating.
Okay.
So
C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, I like C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
Yeah. I like a number of other authors that I would not name publicly.
Okay.
For fear of ruining my reputation.
All right. And a little bit about Ligonier. So can you tell us what's going on with Ligonier? I know RC was kind of the spearhead of Ligonier Ministries. He's gone to be with the Lord. So
Right. RC died in 2017. And I think he showed his Presbyterianism by his passion to work with others to ensure that the ministry would go on.
Okay.
So while he was alive, he created a teaching fellowship, and he wanted the witness of Ligonier to the Bible and to Reformed Christianity to continue, and it just showed his wisdom and care that the ministry has really grown and significantly since he went to be with the Lord. And this is significantly because of Chris Larson, who's the president of Ligonier, and the team that he has assembled who have made such wise use of technology to spread Ligonier teaching series around the world and increasingly in a variety of languages. So it's been amazing. I think Ligonier was able to say that it had contact with about 50 million people last year around the world.
Wow.
And while that's a very small percentage of the world's population, it's a dramatic growth in Ligonier's reaching out and contacting people, and very exciting to see around the world.
Is it new material that Ligonier's putting out, or is it kind of bringing R.C. Sproul stuff still to the forefront?
It's really both.
Okay.
One of the big things that Ligonier has been doing is translating the Reformation Study Bible into a variety of languages.
Okay.
We hope within the next, 10 years to have study Bibles in languages that will reach 80% of the world's population.
Okay.
And there is also translating Ligonier RC's materials into various languages. Apparently you can see videos of RC preaching in Farsi, for example. And
is it still the same kind of voice? His voice
I,
is so
I
distinct.
think so. I
Okay.
think they've tried to find someone who can at least come close to the drama of RC's
RC,
presentations.
yeah. Okay.
And but a lot of new material as well from the teaching
Okay.
fellows. Yeah.
And as the chairman, so you're the chairman of the board.
I'm chairman of the board,
that
so I have a sort of
oversees-
overseeing advisory capacity.
Okay.
I'm not related to the day-to-day operation
Okay.
of the ministry. So
All right.
I still live in California.
Yeah, in Escondido.
Right.
Okay.
And travel 3 or 4 times a year to Florida to,
Do board meetings.
help out.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah.
All right. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's
Yeah.
been a pleasure to be
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Blessings on your work.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Bob. All right. That's a wrap.